The invitation arrived 3 days before the party. Not fashionably late, forgotten late. A glossy card with elegant script that somehow felt cold in my hands, tucked inside an envelope with my name scrawled as an afterthought. Lydia's engagement, party, the family estate. Black tie required. I held that card for a long time, feeling its weight. Such a small thing to carry so much history, so much pain. Part of me wanted to throw it away, pretend I never received it. But the other part, the part that still remembered being 7 years old, desperate to sit at the grown-up table, that part whispered, maybe this time will be different. It wasn't. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes the loneliest moments connect us to people we've never met, and I find comfort in that. From the moment I stepped through those familiar oak doors, I felt it. The air itself seemed to shift, conversations dying just long enough for eyes to find me, assess me, and look away. My Aunt Margaret gave me the kind of nod you'd give a distant acquaintance. Polite, dismissive, final, no embrace, no darling, so glad you came. Just that nod. And then her attention was elsewhere. Her voice suddenly animated as she turned to someone more worthy of her warmth. I moved through the ballroom like a ghost haunting her own wake. The chandeliers cast the same golden light they had when I was a child, when these same people had called me precocious, brilliant, the one with so much potential. Now their eyes slid past me as if I were furniture. Expensive furniture they no longer had use for. The conversations I approached seemed to dissolve before I could join them. Not rudely. My family was too sophisticated for outright cruelty. Instead, they wielded silence like a blade, cutting me out with surgical precision. A laugh would rise just as I drew near, then fade into murmurs I wasn't meant to hear. Shoulders would turn, creating walls I couldn't breach. Excuse me. Could you bring us more champagne? The voice belonged to Harrison, my cousin's college roommate, someone I'd known since I was 15. He was looking at me expectantly, holding out his empty glass, genuinely mistaking me for the help. The moment stretched between us, crystalline and sharp. I could have corrected him, could have reminded him who I was, who I'd always been. Instead, I smiled, that practiced smile I'd perfected over years of swallowing words, and said, I think you'll find the servers are wearing white. He blinked, confusion flickering across his face before recognition dawned. The embarrassment that followed wasn't his alone. I felt it too, that familiar burn of being so forgettable that even people who'd known me for decades couldn't place me without my family's context. But it was Uncle Gerard who delivered the killing blow. He found me standing near the terrace doors, watching the party through the glass like I was already outside of it. His voice cut through the ambient noise with the kind of authority that demanded attention, and suddenly, I was the center of a circle I hadn't asked to join. Well, well, look who decided to grace us with her presence. His smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Still chasing those little projects of yours, sweetheart? Must be exhausting, always being on the brink. The laughter that followed was cultured, refined, and absolutely poisonous. I felt it settle in my chest like acid, burning through whatever was left of my childhood hope. These people, my blood, my family, were enjoying my humiliation like it was entertainment. Like my struggles were a joke they'd been waiting, all evening to share. I smiled back at Gerard. Not because I found anything funny, but because I'd learned long ago that sometimes a smile is the only armor you have left. Still working, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake inside my chest. You know how it is. More laughter. Someone, I think it was Cousin Patricia, murmured something about playing at business that made the others snicker. I stood there, surrounded by the people who were supposed to love me, and felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. That's when I realized something had shifted inside me. Not broken. I'd been broken for years. But something else. A door closing. A decision made. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was simply done. I excused myself, stepping away from their circle of cruelty with the same grace my grandmother had taught me for accepting compliments. No one tried to stop me. No one asked where I was going. I might as well have been invisible. But I wasn't invisible. Not really. Because as I moved toward the edge of the room, I caught sight of James, my assistant, my friend, my anchor in the storm, standing quietly near the wall. He wasn't supposed to be here. We'd agreed he'd wait in the car, but somehow, seeing him there, his presence felt like the first genuine warmth I'd encountered all evening. Our eyes met across the room, and he gave me the slightest nod. A question without words. Are you ready? I wasn't sure what I was ready for. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that room another minute, surrounded by people who saw me as entertainment, as a cautionary tale, as anything but family. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when I'd been their golden child, their bright hope, the one they'd whisper about with pride. She's going to do something special, they'd say. Mark my words, that girl will surprise us all. And I had surprised them, just not in the way they'd expected. The break had been gradual, then sudden, like a bone that weakens under pressure until one day it simply snaps. It started when I graduated from business school and declined their offer to join the family firm, not because I thought I was too good for it, but because I wanted to build something of my own. Something that would succeed or fail on its own merits, not because of a name I'd inherited. They called it pride. I called it necessity. The disappointment in their voices when I announced my decision still echoed in my memory. But darling, my mother had said, why would you want to struggle when you don't have to? We've built something here. Something that could be yours. What she couldn't understand, what none of them could understand, was that I needed to earn my place in the world. I needed to know that my successes were mine, not borrowed, not gifted, not inherited. I needed to fail magnificently and recover completely, to build something from nothing, and know that I was capable of more than just carrying on a legacy. So I'd walked away from their golden handcuffs and into the uncertain darkness of entrepreneurship. And for 3 years, I'd stumbled through that darkness, learning to see without their light, learning to stand without their support. The first year had been the hardest. I'd rented a tiny office above a bakery, the kind of place where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the sound of traffic, where success was measured in small victories, and survival was a daily choice. I'd eaten more ramen than I cared to remember, had more doors slammed in my face than I could count. But I'd also discovered something in that tiny office, something I'd never known I possessed: resilience. Not the kind that's born from privilege, or cushioned by safety nets, but the kind that emerges from necessity, from the choice between giving up and getting up. My family didn't see those nights when I'd fallen asleep at my desk, my face pressed against financial projections and business plans. They didn't see the mornings when I'd wake up with keyboard marks on my cheek and the determination to try again. They saw my absence from their dinner parties, my declined invitations to their charity galas, my silence when they asked about my little venture. They interpreted my distance as arrogance, my focus as rejection. What they couldn't understand was that I wasn't moving away from them. I was moving toward something. Toward a version of myself that existed independent of their expectations, their approval, their carefully constructed world. The business had grown slowly, organically. Not the meteoric rise they would have celebrated, but steady progress built, on solid foundations. I'd learned to read markets the way my grandmother had read people, with patience, intuition, and an eye for details others missed. I'd assembled a team not of friends or family connections, but of people who shared my vision, who believed in what we were building. James had been one of the first to join me. Not as an assistant, initially, but as a partner, a collaborator, a voice of reason when the weight of uncertainty threatened to crush my resolve. He'd seen something in my tiny office above the bakery that I'd barely seen in myself. Potential that had nothing to do with where I came from, and everything to do with where I was willing to go. Over the months, then years, he'd become more than a business partner. He'd become the family I'd chosen, the support system I'd built rather than inherited. When I succeeded, he celebrated with genuine joy. When I failed, he helped me analyze what went wrong without making me feel like a failure. He saw me not as the disappointing daughter who'd rejected her birthright, but as the entrepreneur who'd chosen her own path. My family didn't know about the contracts we'd won, the clients who'd become partners, the quiet recognition we'd earned in our industry. They didn't know about the long nights that had turned into breakthrough mornings, the risks that had become rewards, the small victories that had accumulated into something substantial. They only knew that I'd chosen to build something outside their influence, and that choice had made me a stranger to them. At family gatherings, I'd become the uncomfortable, silence in conversations about success, the asterisk in stories about achievement. They'd learned to talk around me, about me, but rarely to me. And I'd learned to carry that isolation like a weight I couldn't put down, even as I'd built something beautiful in spite of it. Tonight, standing in that ballroom surrounded by people who'd written me off, I felt the full weight of that journey. Not the burden of it, but the strength I'd gained from carrying it. I'd come to this party not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to myself. That I could stand in their space without needing their approval. That I could be in their presence without losing myself. I'd chosen my outfit carefully that evening. Not the designer gown they'd expect, not the jewelry that would signal wealth or status. Instead, I'd worn black, simple, elegant, deliberate. A dress that spoke in whispers rather than shouts, that suggested rather than declared. I'd learned that true confidence doesn't announce itself, it simply exists. My hair was pulled back in a low chignon, no elaborate styling, no statement accessories. I'd wanted to look like myself, not the version of myself they'd expected me to become, not the version they'd tried to mold me into, but the person I'd discovered in those years of building something from nothing. James had understood the significance of this night without me having to explain it. He'd offered to drive me, to wait outside, to be my anchor in whatever storm might come. He knew, as I did, that this wasn't really about Lydia's engagement. This was about closure, about finally, definitively, choosing myself over their acceptance. As I stood at the edge of the party, watching my family celebrate without me, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not the peace of belonging, but the peace of no longer needing to belong. I'd spent years trying to earn my way back into their good graces, trying to prove that my choices hadn't been mistakes. Tonight, I realized I no longer needed their validation. Their opinion of my life had become irrelevant to my living of it. The party swirled around me like a familiar dance I'd forgotten the steps to. Crystal clinked against crystal. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. Conversations flowed in the carefully choreographed manner of people who'd known each other all their lives. I watched it with the detachment of an anthropologist studying a culture she'd once belonged to but no longer understood. My cousin Marcus approached me at one point, his face flushed with champagne and something that might have been guilt. "Hey, stranger," he said, his voice carrying the forced joviality of someone trying to bridge a gap they'd helped create. "Long time no see." "Hello, Marcus." I kept my voice neutral, pleasant. Not warm, but not cold either. Just polite. "So, how's the business going? Mom mentioned you were doing some kind of consulting thing." Some kind of consulting thing. As if 3 years of building a company, of securing clients, of creating something sustainable and meaningful could be dismissed so casually, as if my life's work was a hobby that polite people inquired about to fill awkward silences. "It's going well," I said simply. I didn't elaborate. Didn't explain about the expansion we'd just completed, the new office space we'd moved into, the team we'd grown from 3 people to 15. Didn't mention the industry recognition we'd received, the speaking engagements I'd been invited to, the competitors who'd tried to poach our clients. Marcus nodded, his eyes already drifting away, looking for an excuse to escape the conversation. "That's great. Really great. Well, I should go find Sarah. You know how she gets when I disappear too long." And then he was gone, absorbed back into the crowd, as if our conversation had never happened, as if I had never happened. But I was happening. Every day, in ways they couldn't see or wouldn't acknowledge, I was happening. The business we'd built was thriving, not just surviving, but growing, expanding, making a difference in ways that mattered to me. We weren't just another consulting firm. We were helping companies transition to sustainable practices, finding ways for businesses to profit while contributing to solutions rather than problems. The work fulfilled me in ways I hadn't expected. Not just the financial success, though that had come gradually and then suddenly, but the knowledge that what we were building had purpose beyond profit. We were creating value, real value, for our clients and for the world. We were part of something larger than ourselves. James had been instrumental in this growth, his vision complementing mine in ways that made our partnership feel inevitable. He'd brought operational excellence to my strategic thinking, practical wisdom to my ambitious dreams. Together, we'd built something that neither of us could have created alone. The success had come quietly, almost secretly. We deliberately kept a low profile, focusing on the work rather than the recognition, on building rather than broadcasting. Our clients knew our worth. Our competitors respected our capabilities. Our team believed in our mission. We didn't need the validation of industry awards or media attention, though both had started to come. What we'd built was solid, sustainable, and entirely our own. No family money, no inherited connections, no shortcuts or safety nets. Just vision, hard work, and the kind of partnership that makes extraordinary things feel possible. Standing in that ballroom, I realized that my family's dismissal of my choices had become irrelevant to the reality of my life. They could call it a consulting thing or little projects all they wanted. The truth existed independent of their understanding of it. I was no longer the person who needed their approval to feel worthy. I was no longer the daughter who carried their disappointment like a stone in her chest. I was an entrepreneur, a leader, a woman who'd built something meaningful with her own hands and her own mind. The realization was liberating and terrifying, in equal measure. If I no longer needed their approval, what was I doing here? Why had I come to this party, worn this dress, subjected myself to their barely concealed contempt? The answer came to me slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape I'd never seen before. I'd come to witness, not to prove anything to them, but to see clearly, perhaps for the first time, who they really were and who I really was in relation to them. They were people who measured worth by inheritance rather than achievement, who valued conformity over courage, who chose comfort over growth. They weren't evil or malicious. They were simply limited by their own narrow definitions of success and belonging. And I was someone who'd chosen a different path, who'd risked everything to build something authentic, who'd traded the security of their approval for the uncertainty of self-determination. I was no longer their problem child or their disappointment. I was simply myself, complete and sufficient and free. As the evening progressed, I found myself moving toward the exit. Not running away, not storming out in dramatic fashion, but simply choosing to leave. I'd seen what I'd come to see, learned what I'd needed to learn. My presence here had served its purpose. I was almost to the door when I heard James's voice, quiet, but perfectly clear in the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby conversation. Your jet is ready. 4 words, spoken softly, without drama or emphasis. But in the context of that room, at that moment, they landed like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the polite pause of people processing information, but the stunned quiet of people whose understanding of reality has just shifted fundamentally. I turned slightly, just enough to see the faces around me. Lydia, mid-laugh, her mouth still open in surprise. Uncle Gerard, his condescending smile frozen in place. Marcus, his champagne glass halfway to his lips. Aunt Margaret, her eyes wide with something that might have been recognition, or might have been fear. James stood near the wall, his expression, calm and professional, as if he'd simply delivered a message rather than detonated a bomb. His presence, which had seemed incongruous in this room of inherited wealth and practiced elegance, suddenly made perfect sense. I smiled. Not the practiced smile I'd worn all evening, but something genuine and serene. Thank you, James. And then I walked away. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the measured pace of someone who had somewhere important to be. Behind me, I could hear the whispers starting, the urgent conversations, the sudden need to understand what they'd just witnessed. Your jet is ready. The words followed me out of the ballroom, down the marble steps, into the cool night air. I could imagine the conversations already beginning, the frantic phone calls, the desperate Googling of my name. They'd want to know how, when, why. They'd want to understand how the family disappointment had acquired a private jet, how the daughter who'd rejected their path had found her own way to success. But their understanding was no longer my concern. Their approval was no longer my goal. Their opinion of my choices was no longer relevant to my life. I reached the car where James was waiting, the same calm professionalism on his face that had served him so well inside. "How do you feel?" he asked as he opened the door for me. "Free," I said, and realized it was the first completely honest thing I'd said all evening. As we drove away from the estate, I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me I needed to see again. The people in that ballroom would spend the rest of the evening, maybe the rest of their lives, trying to reconcile the person they dismissed with the person who'd just walked out of their world. They'd created a story about me that made them comfortable, that justified their treatment of me, that allowed them to feel superior to the choices I'd made. Tonight, that story had been revealed as fiction. The truth was simpler and more complex than anything they could have imagined. I'd left their world not in failure, but in hope. I'd built something not to prove them wrong, but to prove myself right. I'd succeeded not in spite of their rejection, but because of my acceptance of it. There was no jet, of course. James had chosen those words carefully, knowing they would resonate in a room full of people who measured worth by possessions, who understood power only in terms they could quantify. He'd spoken their language to deliver a message they couldn't ignore. The person they'd dismissed was no longer the person standing before them. The real power wasn't in the jet that didn't exist, but in the life I'd built that they couldn't see. It was in the team that trusted my leadership, the clients who valued our work, the difference we were making in ways that mattered. It was in the choice I'd made to walk away from their table, not because I couldn't earn a seat, but because I'd built my own. Some people inherit their worth. Others discover it. Some are given their place in the world. Others create it. As we drove through the city, I'd learned to call home, past the office where I'd built my dreams, toward the life I'd chosen rather than inherited. I realized something profound. I was no longer waiting for my family to see me clearly. I was finally seeing myself. They'd deleted my name from their story, but they'd never owned my ending.